A Nigerian army commander speaks to the locals in a tribe doused in fears from attacks 2 days earlier where men, women and children were killed. Damasak, in Borno State, Nigeria's northeast region, is in the heart of an insurgency by the Boko Haram terrorist group. On 20th of March, villagers in Dakar, Kirkuk are evacuated as a result of insurgent attacks by groups believed to be Islamic State members. Manifestations of threats at state, regional and global levels have become chaotic, introducing new ways of seeking solutions to tackle the new forms of violence, be it banditry, kidnappings, or the infamous insurgency.
At this point, it is my privilege to introduce our moderator.
Whiting Institute for Strategy, Education and Research, WISER, set up to help organizations navigate effective security sector governance, is taking no chance at letting the carnage continue. This webinar it has organized to get results.
WISER is interested in the growth of non-state armed groups, especially in Nigeria, across the African continent and the world in general, with mostly dangerous implications to national and regional security because of the violent tendency and human rights abusiveness. In Nigeria particularly, while there are indications of some non-state armed groups partnering with government to improve security, the most are the ones that characterize the increasingly dangerous security situation as insurgent groups with ethno-religious sectarian motivations, or just simply violent criminal gangs involved in kidnapping for ransom and armed robbery. The activities of non-state armed groups certainly deserve special attention to understand their purpose, motivations, and how to address them within state, regional, and security sector governance frameworks.
That submission sets the tone for further analysis from experts drawn from the National Democratic Institute, Washington, D.C., Center for Peace and Security Studies, African Security Initiative of the Brooklyn Institute, Washington, D.C., an ex-commander of the United Nations mission in Liberia, Institute of African and Diasporic Studies, as many more people joined the virtual meeting from across the world. First to go on the troubling topic, implication of the rise of non-state armed groups to global and national security, is Dr. Lauren Van Meter, whose research stems from community levels upward, soon establishes a dangerous nexus between politicians, vigilante groups, and evolution of armed non-state actors in a negotiated relationship that has lost control.
This fundamental relationship, this negotiated relationship, also determines how an armed group exercises violence, whether it is protective or predatory. The other sort of characteristic that I think is important for understanding around community armed groups is that they are extremely fluid organizations. Their identities can shift rapidly from community security groups to vigilante groups to state-sponsored militias to ethnic militias or even other configurations and transitions. And one of my goals in this paper was what explained this fluidity and how could we better understand it? So as non-state armed groups are deployed more and more in the fight against violent extremism in Africa and elsewhere, it's critical to understand and monitor how these groups conduct themselves internally and what might push them from protective to predatory behaviors. How do they get their resources? Do they have to prey on the community to sustain themselves? Have they seized economic assets that mean they don't rely on communities or the state for resourcing and legitimacy? Do they have an internal code of conduct? And how do they indoctrinate their new members? And how are members disciplined within the structure? What is their leadership structure? How are members recruited? Do they come just from one ethnic group, raising the risk of ethnic violence? Are members mercenaries, or do they join in support of a larger cause? How many members are in the group? Too many for leaders to control. Why is this so important to understand? Because when these non-state armed groups experience a shift in their external environment, a rising threat, a weakening state, international pressures, this can dramatically change the non-state armed groups' internal operations so that they may become more violent, more predatory, or in turn, it may offer an opportunity to negotiate or put pressure for a more positive outcome.
The concerns are critical as they are crucial to the survival of any state, prompting the question, why are non-state armed groups emerging?
There are several factors that are giving rise to this. The first is that discontent with the role of the state when it comes to protecting the lives and property of the citizens provides the basis for citizens to look elsewhere for their own security. And by looking elsewhere, they believe that putting in place community level structures for protection and public safety, as well as crime control, becomes the major alternative that they can leverage on. And by so doing, as they provide alternatives to the state does not command the kind of respect that the state should command, because it has abdicated its primary duties and responsibility to these armed groups. And by doing so, the legitimacy of these groups in the face of communities increases. And as their legitimacy increases, they continue to usurp the powers of the state. They continue to take over the public space that the state is supposed to even be in charge of. And that is why increasingly we are also witnessing the huge gulf or distance that exists between the state and the citizens in the context of the social contract that exists between the state and the citizens when it comes to protecting such citizens.
He further establishes the porosity of Nigerian borders as part of the problem which must be addressed in the quest to stop infiltration and attacks by armed non-state groups on innocent citizens. The solution of which he insists must be a structured regional integration action plan.
Today, when you talk of Boko Haram, you talk about its linkage with Niger, with Cameroon and Chad. When you talk about Al-Qaeda, you talk about its global outreach in terms of the connectedness that it is enjoying and solidarity that is enjoying beyond or across borders. So the only way we can deal with this issue by virtue of the regional implication it has is to have these regional groupings begin to think more deeply about how they can have a whole of region response to dealing with it.
The talks were extensive, touching on the risks of modern-day security challenge for West African states by another guest speaker. For her, the coronavirus pandemic has laid bare the vulnerability of governments and armed groups.
COVID has strengthened non-state armed actors in multifaceted ways. It didn't strengthen every single non-state armed actor, whether this is the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico or a pro-government militia in Myanmar or an ethnic clan-based militia in Somalia in the same way. But by and large, it strengthened them significantly. Why is that? Well, COVID has pushed hundreds of millions of people into extreme poverty. When a major assessment was done back in June of 2020, the projection was that 150 million people would be pushed into extreme poverty. We now know, even though we don't have more updated data, that the number is much larger than that. And this is not true just in Africa. We are seeing it in various parts of Asia. We are seeing that in Latin America as well. Now, the way people have been pushed into extreme poverty is significant. Many of them had to liquidate all of their productive assets, all of their means and access to education, even after schools reopen, all of their means and access toward public health. So it means that a very large segment of the world population will continue being separated from the state, really severed from the state and from formal public provision of resources, even more than it was prior to COVID-19. Very many of the people who have been pushed into extreme poverty have been pushed into participation in illegality, in illegal economies as their only means of survival. And with that, of course, they come into contact, if they had not prior to that, with non-state armed actors, be they militants that participate in illicit economies or criminal groups that operate them. And finally, I would add that the notion that DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and the integration eventually happens is enormously elusive. There are really very few rare instances where DDR of the vigilante and militia groups takes place. Most of the time, they are not interested in DDR. The mechanisms of DDR tend to be weak, and the groups in some form exist for years or decades and continue to be a significant political as well as security actor.
For the doctor, there are inevitable steps governments must apply now, as she also points out what will continually be the driver of non-state players.
This is particularly the case when governments have already been under fiscal threat prior to COVID and have been dependent either on tourism as a source of income or extractive industries as a source of income. So the budgets of all governments have taken significant hits in various parts like Latin America or in Africa. We are seeing budget GDP contractions on the order of 10%. Even in places like India, we are seeing the worst economic contraction in decades. In many parts of the world, it's really the biggest economic catastrophe since at least World War II or in a very long time. That has several implications. In the first place, it means that governments will have fewer financial and material resources to mount security law enforcement operations against violent actors. Now, it also, unfortunately, in my view, likely means that many of the governments with scarce resources or less ability to pay security forces will have greater willingness to authorize brutality, very heavy-handed responses that are absolutely inappropriate and deeply counterproductive.
Saying very little, but with accordance to the gravity it carries, General Uba, on his part, minced no words, putting the roots of the rise of armed groups squarely at the feet of politicians.
The conflicts and wars in Africa are caused mainly by the circumstances of life occasioned by unfavorable political, socio-economic, and environmental phenomena. Scholars and practitioners have generally asserted that the causes of violent conflict in Africa have been profound and pervasive, and that any peace effort that does not address the roots of the socio-political and economic problems of conflict is likely to fail.
Within Nigeria, I think these groups will continue to operate. This will affect the legitimacy of the state in kind of various ways. I think it's gonna vary depending on obviously on the region and stuff, and each local context is different. But as a whole, I think it definitely poses a challenge to the legitimacy of the Nigerian state when you have a proliferation of these groups. And I think one concern that I have is looking at Amatekun and Abubeagu is that maybe the governors are kind of going to fall into a trap that the federal government fell into with the militants in the Niger Delta, which is essentially you have to pay these, you've already got the youths, you've already got the people, they're armed, they're upset with insecurity, with various other things, and they could, if you don't have them under your control, or at least if you don't have rather not so much control, but if you don't have a working arrangement with them, which almost always involves finances of some sort, they can cause problems. So we've seen that in the Niger Delta, where a lot of these erstwhile militants are kind of bought off and reincorporated semi-officially into the state security apparatus, to guard pipelines or whatever. And I do wonder if there might be challenges like that for some of the local governors, moving forward with these kind of vigilante missions in the Southwest.
As the session comes to an end, hopes of a more peaceful society, especially for West Africa, beckons. This, however, will need concerted efforts to disarm militia groups in Africa and elsewhere and ensure that the guise of protecting the citizens remains the priority and one that governments must act upon. Gimba Umar, Control TV News.